Azure interview questions and answers. Beginner means advanced, based on the same format as your pasted example. Introduction. Azure is Microsoft's cloud computing platform used to build, deploy, and manage applications using services like compute, storage, networking, databases, AI, security, and DevOps. 1 to 20. Azure Basics. What is Azure? Azure is Microsoft's cloud platform for hosting apps, databases, storage, networking, and AI services. Why use Azure? Check. Scalable, secure, global infrastructure, pay-as-you-go pricing, supports cloud-native apps. What is cloud computing? Delivering computing services like servers, databases, storage, and software over the internet. Azure service models. Check. EAS, check. PaaS, check. SaaS, serverless. What is EAS? Infrastructure as a service, such as Azure Virtual Machines. What is PaaS? Platform as a service, such as Azure App Service. Software as a service, such as Microsoft 365. What is Azure Portal? Web-based UI to manage Azure resources. What is Azure Resource Group? Logical container for Azure resources. Billing and access boundary for Azure resources. What is Azure Region? Geographic location where Azure services run. What is Availability Zone? Separate data center location inside an Azure region. What is Azure VM? Virtual machine in Azure Cloud. Virtual machine hosted in Azure. What is Azure App Service? PaaS service to host web apps and APIs. What is Azure Storage? Cloud storage service for files, blobs, queues, and tables. Object storage for files, images, videos, backups, and logs. What is Azure SQL Database? Managed Relational Database Service. What is Cosmos DB? Globally distributed NoSQL database. What is Azure CLI? Command line tool to manage Azure. What is Azure PowerShell? PowerShell module for Azure automation. 21 to 40. Compute, storage, networking. Azure VM versus App Service. VM gives more control. App Service gives easier hosting and management. What is Azure Functions? Serverless compute service for event-driven code. What is AKS? Azure Kubernetes service for running containerized applications. What is Azure Container Apps? Serverless container hosting platform. What is Azure Container Registry? Private registry for Docker container images. What is Virtual Network? Private network in Azure. What is Subnet? Smaller network segment inside a virtual network. What is NSG? Network Security Group controls inbound and outbound traffic. What is Azure Load Balancer? Distributes traffic across back-end resources. What is Application Gateway? Layer 7 load balancer for web applications. What is Azure Front Door? Global entry point for fast and secure web traffic. What is VPN Gateway? Connects on-premises network to Azure. What is ExpressRoute? Private dedicated connection to Azure. What is Azure DNS? DNS hosting service. What is Storage Account? Container for Azure Storage Services. Blob versus file storage? Blob is object storage. File storage is managed file share. What is queue storage? Messaging service for async communication. What is table storage? NoSQL key value storage. What is Azure Disk? Managed disk attached to Azure VM. What is CDN? Content Delivery Network for faster content delivery. 41 to 70. Security, identity, DevOps. What is Microsoft Entra ID? Identity and Access Management Service. What is RBAC? Role-based access control for permissions. Azure Managed Identity for apps to access resources securely. What is Key Vault? Secure storage for secrets, keys, and certificates. What is Azure Policy? Enforces rules and compliance. Monitoring service for metrics and logs. What is Application Insights? Application Performance Monitoring Tool. What is Log Analytics? Query and analyze logs using KQL. What is KQL? Kusto query language used for Azure logs. What is Azure Advisor? Gives recommendations for cost, security, reliability, and performance. What is Azure DevOps? Platform for CI/CD, repos, boards, testing, and artifacts. What is Azure Pipelines? CI/CD service for build and deployment. What is CI/CD? Continuous integration and continuous deployment. JSON-based infrastructure as code template. What is Bicep? Simpler language for Azure infrastructure as code. What is Terraform in Azure? IAC tool used to provision Azure resources. What is blue-green deployment? Deploying new version beside old version, then switching traffic. What is deployment slot? App service feature to test before production swap. What is autoscaling? Automatically increasing or decreasing resources. What is availability set? VM grouping for high availability. What is Azure Backup? Backup service for Azure and on-premises workloads. What is Site Recovery? Disaster recovery service. What is Defender for Cloud? Security, posture, and threat protection service. What is Sentinel? Cloud-native SIEM and security analytics platform. What is Private Endpoint? Private network access to Azure services. What is Service Endpoint? Secure access to Azure services from virtual networks. Private Endpoint versus Service Endpoint. Private Endpoint uses private IP. Service Endpoint secures service access from subnet. What is Azure Firewall? Managed Network Firewall Service. What is DDoS protection? Protection against distributed denial of service attacks. What is Zero Trust? Security model based on Never Trust, Always Verify. 71 to 100. Advanced Azure and Architecture. What is Azure Well-Architected Framework? Azure architecture guidance based on reliability, security, cost optimization, operational excellence, and performance efficiency. 5 pillars of Azure Well-Architected Framework. Reliability, security, cost optimization, operational excellence, performance efficiency. What is high availability? Designing systems to stay available during failures. Restoring service after major failure. What is RTO? Recovery time objective. What is RPO? Recovery point objective. What is horizontal scaling? Adding more instances. Increasing CPU RAM of existing instance. What is serverless architecture? Running code without managing servers. Azure Functions trigger examples. Check HTTP, check timer, 2, check blob, event grid. Event routing service. What is Service Bus? Enterprise messaging service. Service Bus versus Queue storage. Service Bus supports advanced messaging. Queue storage is simpler. What is Event Hub? Big data, event streaming platform. Event Hub versus Service Bus. Event Hub is for streaming. Service Bus is for messaging workflows. What is API management? Service to publish, secure, monitor, and manage APIs. What is Logic Apps? Workflow automation service. What is Azure Data Factory? Data integration and ETL service. What is Synapse Analytics? Analytics platform for big data and data warehousing. What is Azure Cache for Redis? Managed Redis cache for performance improvement. What is Azure Spring Apps? Managed service for Spring Boot applications. What is Azure App Configuration? Centralized configuration management. What is Azure Cost Management? Tool to monitor and optimize cloud spending. Right-size resources. Use autoscaling. Delete unused resources. Use reservations. Monitor cost alerts. How to secure Azure apps. RBAC. Key Vault. Managed identity. Private endpoints. Monitoring. Encryption. How to monitor Azure applications. Azure Monitor. Application insights. Log analytics. Alerts. Dashboards. How to deploy Spring Boot app to Azure. Use Azure App Service, Azure Spring Apps, Containers, or AKS. How to deploy React app to Azure. Use Azure Static Web Apps, App Service, or Storage Static Website. Common Azure interview focus areas. Check. Cloud Basics. Check. Networking. Check. Identity/security. Check. Monitoring. DevOps. Check. Cost optimization. Check. Architecture. How to become strong in Azure. Course. Learn core services, practice deployments, understand networking, learn identity, RBAC, monitor logs, build real projects, study well-architected framework. Final summary. Azure interviews focus on cloud computing basics, compute, storage, and networking, identity and security, DevOps and CI/CD, monitoring and logging, high availability and disaster recovery, cost optimization, architecture best practices. Key idea. Strong Azure developers understand how to build secure, scalable, reliable, and cost-effective cloud applications.